Liu Jinji is rather special. It's not simply because he has his suits made in Hong Kong or because he's driven around Shanghai in his own Cadillac. He's special because he's a self-made millionaire still living in China. At 80, he says he's so much money that he doesn't know what to do with it. He made his fortune here in the 20s and 30s, working his way up from apprentice to become the owner of a textile empire. This is one of the factories he used to own. After the revolution, he continued to run it as a private company. When the factory was eventually nationalized in 1956, he remained as its managing director on a large salary and a small share of the profits. During the Cultural Revolution, all this changed.
每一家都是东西都抄光了，好吧，都拿走。那么财产呢，所有的存款呢，都是冻结起来的。我这到工厂，那么去了之后呢，扫地，一两年就扫地这样子。好在工人队伍呢，因为过去关系还好，还可以，没有十分这个。
老头子忙忙弄，中间忙忙弄，打他到弄个里下来，弄到你这个接待呀的。啊？没啥呀。弄一个老年轻的一个，应该没啥个法子的一个。
Following his rehabilitation, his house, antique furniture, porcelain collection, and 1,000 priceless paintings were all returned to him. He even got his back pay with interest. This apparent act of generosity marked a major change in the government's attitude to business and trade. It's desperate to encourage economic development and even needs the skills of former capitalists like Liu to help regenerate industry. As part of their contribution, Liu and other rehabilitated Shanghai businessmen have set up a construction company.
浑水私人帮，所以都是正确的。那么把过去的冻结的款子，都发完了。那么大家拿了这么多钱，怎么用呢？好吧？那么我是不是可能来一个公司来替国家多做一些这个贡献的力量，在建设方贡献的力量，大家都赞成。因此这一来之后呢，大概凑到了5720万，大家议论班都，说我们工商界再来搞一公司，人家误解，好吧？大家已经变了啥？所以这样来的。那么大家从爱国出发，那么这样子爱国出发，我们将来赚了钱怎么办呢？赚了钱实际上为公的，从爱国出发来在国家建设当中来贡献一点力量，所以叫爱国建设公司，是这样。
The company has already created several thousand new jobs. These blocks of luxury apartments are their biggest investment so far. They're built for sale to overseas Chinese traders who plan to do business in Shanghai. The directors of the company keep a careful eye on the building's progress and try to ensure it's built to Western standards. These men recognize how important the overseas Chinese community is in the country's development and hope to persuade them to come here with their cash and contacts. Liu Jinji says they won't keep the profits, but will plow them back into China. It's this, says Liu, that makes the company patriotic. Shanghai was once the center of capitalism in China. Today, former capitalists are again becoming influential here, as the present government seems keener on results than ideology. Once more, Shanghai is a center of political and economic experiment. As China's leading industrial center and port, it plays a significant role in China's overseas trade. But its influence and trading importance is recent. For much of China's history, trade went overland. This is a modern version of a 1200-year-old dance. The dancers are washing silk by the Silk Road. For centuries, this was China's most important trade route, and along it, the West first came into contact with China. As early as the 2nd century AD, the Romans were importing silk and complaining about its price. There are no grand caravans traveling the Silk Road today, just a few camels for local trade. But for more than 1,500 years, camels carrying silk and porcelain, grapes and roses, spices and minerals, traveled the 5,000-mile route which ran from Antioch on the East Mediterranean coast to northwest China and Kashgar. It rejoined beyond Tuofan and then ran on to the heartland of China, where it terminated at the ancient capital of Chang'an, now the city of Xi'an. One of the larger oasis stops on the route was at Tuofan. The town is no longer a stopover for Arab, Persian and Indian traders, but today's market would still be recognizable to them. China's trade and traders were always controlled by the emperors. Trade in this area was first opened up 2,000 years ago by the Emperor Han Wudi, when he sent an envoy to Central Asia to try to establish an alliance against the Huns. It opened up land contact with the West for 1,500 years, stimulating demand for Chinese goods like silk and later porcelain. A specialist merchant class emerged, and early forms of banking. The Chinese were the first to use paper money. No doubt there were dentists too. Market dentistry has moved on a bit, but the most potent advertisement is still the number of successful extractions. Emperors realized that markets and traders were valuable to them, but they wanted to control the merchants to ensure that they served the ruler. So they gave them the lowest social status, below the scholar, peasant and artisan. Socially and politically deprived, merchants were never able to use their wealth against the government. For all that, merchants prospered, and great cities developed along the Silk Road. Gaocheng is a few miles from Tuofan. It was established by the Tang dynasty as an administrative and trading center in the 7th century. But this is northwest China, a region where Chinese influence and authority were not complete. And cities like this also were set up to control the local people. Trade led to other great changes in China. New beliefs and new peoples came along the caravan routes. Buddhism was brought from India along the Silk Road. Indians, Persians and Arabs handled much of the trade with China. Only a few Europeans made the journey. The old route through the boiling desert and mountains of northwest China is as harsh as when Marco Polo traveled it in the 13th century. Marco Polo, the most famous European to journey to China, left Venice in 1271. He followed the Silk Road to the Mongol court, where he served Kublai Khan for 17 years. Although most contacts with the West had been overland, Chinese boats were trading extensively, particularly with Southeast Asia. When Marco Polo left China, it was from this port of Chenzhou, which was then called Zaitan. Then he could write of the port that it was one of the 2 greatest havens in the world for commerce. Today the port is silted up, but its early importance is still remembered in the local museum. This vessel is about 1,000 years old, a Sung boat which sank in the harbor 250 years before Marco Polo visited China. On the ship were found merchants' name tags, coins, and chess pieces. The spices still retain their aroma. The ship had probably just returned from Southeast Asia. It was in ships like this that the Chinese merchant traded as far afield as Japan, the Middle East, and even Africa. After Marco Polo left China, European contact was not officially renewed until the Portuguese came to trade in the late 16th century. After 40 argumentative years, the emperor granted the Portuguese permission to set up a permanent settlement on Chinese territory. This was at Macau, near Canton. Other European powers followed. The British East India Company set up shop in 1699. Canton became the main trading center, but it wasn't enough for British merchants who were determined to force open China's doors to free trade. In 1793, with all the pomp appropriate to his position as ruler of the entire world, the Emperor Qianlong received a representative from George III of England. Lord Macartney asked him for more ports to be opened. The Emperor refused. All that Lord Macartney took back with him was a letter from the Emperor thanking the King for his tribute and continued allegiance, but making it plain China had no need for Britain's goods. Unfortunately for China, Britain had a great need to sell them to her. The reason was tea. Great estates in South China were supplying the British with ever-increasing amounts. The Chinese were perfectly happy to sell tea to Britain, but they only wanted to be paid in silver. This caused a drain on Britain's silver reserves. Just as the Chinese had a plant which the British had become partial to, so the British merchants found one which the Chinese could not do without. The British government deliberately encouraged its sale to solve Britain's balance of trade problem. The product was opium. Opium was grown in India and there processed and stored in vast warehouses ready for export to China. Sales of the drug rose rapidly. The impact on Chinese society was devastating. Hundreds of thousands became addicts, and countless thousands died every year from their addiction. but Britain's official position was that the opium was used for medicinal purposes only. The Chinese authorities tried to ban the import of opium. In 1839, they seized and destroyed 20,000 chests of the drug near Canton. The British government responded swiftly. They sent a small expeditionary force to China and smashed the antiquated Chinese navy. This humiliating defeat was followed by the signing of the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. The Chinese had to concede everything. They were forced to pay for the destroyed opium and, in effect, accept its continued importation. They also conceded the right to trade in 4 new ports, including Shanghai. China, at last, was open to the West. Shanghai quickly became the main trading center. And what happened here and elsewhere in China in the next 100 years left a deep scar on the Chinese memory that would taint dealings with all foreign traders in the future. Shanghai also expanded rapidly as a commercial and industrial center. The textile industry was a major success, supported by cheap labor and modern machinery. There were no laws against employing children. And the cheapest draft power was provided by the Chinese themselves. In this area, the British set up the first foreign concession in Shanghai, established an embassy, and protected their property with British police and troops. In their concession, British, not Chinese, law applied. During the numerous periods of unrest in Shanghai in the 1920s, British troops were frequently out in force. Other Western powers also displayed their presence. Business success was permanently inscribed in the grand buildings of the Bund, and less permanently in company names. Between the 1840s, when the Treaty of Nanking was signed, and the 1920s, the city's population grew from 250,000 to 3 million, with no more than a small fraction being foreign. Although it was a Chinese city, it was run by foreigners. Foreigners could afford to be generous. They made fortunes and lived luxuriously. A few Chinese did too, but most Chinese merely fetched and carried for their new masters.
Nighttime in dear old Shanghai, then I'm dancing, sweetheart, with you.
It was a high time for those Chinese who were able to take advantage of the business opportunities that came with colonialism.
In my arms, dear, away from harm, dear, we'll let the rest of the world go by.
The new wealthy Chinese middle class adopted Western styles as well as new ways of doing business.
The period of relative freedom for Chinese businessmen came to an abrupt end in 1937, when the war with Japan broke out. Millions died throughout China. But the disaster didn't end with the Japanese defeat. 4 years of civil war followed. The right-wing nationalists were eventually forced to retreat, ousted by the communists in 1949. American troops, missionaries, and rich Chinese left at the same time. The doors to China closed and were firmly bolted by an American embargo on trade. The doors opened again in the 1970s, following the end of the Cultural Revolution. Swing is back in Shanghai for the foreign merchants and businessmen who flooded back to China, lured by the call of 1,000 million buyers. At first, the Chinese were out of touch with Western taste and Western business practice, and foreign businessmen didn't understand Chinese attitudes to business, nor appreciate their suspicion of foreigners. Knowledge of one another had stood still. What had changed was China's desperate desire to modernize. Shanghai again was at the center of change, but now under the control of the central government. In the past, it was in the imperial palace where decisions about international trade were made by an all-powerful emperor. Now it isn't the emperor who decides, but the party. Since the Cultural Revolution, decisions have been more widely delegated, but even so, power is still firmly rooted in Peking. It was in the Peking Hotel that many businessmen first got their taste of dealing with the Chinese. The earliest to come in the 1970s complained bitterly that nothing had changed in 150 years. The emperor had gone, but foreigners were still treated as barbarians and were expected to wait until their Chinese host called them to attend meetings. Old habits die hard. Things are easier now. With the Chinese demand for Western knowledge and skills, the world's leading businessmen line up to meet China's most influential trade figures. Rong Yizhen is a Shanghai millionaire who now heads China's main foreign investment organization.
In bringing in foreign investments, certainly we will bring in foreign advanced technology into China. If we could not get high technology transfer into China, and there would naturally be hindrance in the absorbing of foreign investment.
一个呢，就是现在我们要差不多有40万，这个工厂是要改造，在这一方面呢，我们通过这个企业的改造呢，能够提高产品的质量，产量增加化质品种，添加原材料，这样子呢来满足人民这个属于增长的需要，跟国家接受的需要。
There is little doubt that Chinese industry is backward. It is partly because China is poor, but it is also the result of 30 years of economic mismanagement. Small foundries are often a legacy of the great leap forward, when Mao decided that each commune should make its own iron. The experiment was a disaster. Modernizing Chinese industry is a massive task and cannot be done rapidly without drawing on Western talent, ideas and technology, even in the most Chinese of industries. This is one of the finest collections of Chinese antiques and porcelain in the world. It's owned by a New Yorker who deals in reproductions, Mildred Moteheda.
Look at the difference between the detail here on this, the January sample, versus the one that we got in March.
Well, it means they've used another girl. That's what it means. And what
Well,
we
it's
have
more
to...
than that, though, because, look, here are the comments that from the Winterthur Museum regarding these, because they sent us a whole set of Polaroids comparing the antique here, the January one there, and the March one there.
The replicas she sells are based on her collection. Until recently, they were all made in Europe. Now, she and her business director, Charles Donahue, are experimenting with production in China.
But we'll get it as close as we can. They have to just curl the hand up more and move that back, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And no antiquing here. This is disgusting. This is all fake nonsense. And down
see
here...
how the detail that Maria did on this coat and things versus this.
Yes.
It's just
Well, but remember, we trained Maria for 38 years and brought her the originals. Now, these people are
the
just...
Chinese have been making.
I know, but
porcelain
they
longer
have not
than that.
made this for 200 years.
Okay,
So-
we've got about 7 different items, changes that we have to make on these.
The factory where the replicas are made is part of an agricultural commune near Peking. This film is the first record of any kind that foreigners have been allowed to make of porcelain manufacturing since 1706, when secrets taken from China were adopted by Europeans. It's ironic that the Chinese are now having to relearn these same arts from the West.
另外呢，咱们这个官儿和他这要求不一样，是吧？好像是咱们这手啊，呼的这个高一点儿，他那手呢好像还不像这么粗大。
Look at this. Make the thickness in the clay. But you know, we have never had distortion in this.
Business meetings in China tend to be very informal, and nobody ever hurries.
And the colors, certainly you can do the colors better. Look.
Actually, no, if they fit in the front, it's in the back they're too wide. He's at least a half
Look at
an
the
inch.
painting of these feathers. And look at the painting of those feathers. If you hold that, Mr. Chang, look. That's not well defined. Too much heavy glaze. Thinner glaze. This is the one we said.
The Chinese are beginning to learn something of Western business practice. But foreign businessmen complain that decisions are made too slowly and that individuals refuse to take responsibility for decisions for fear of being singled out for criticism.
And, you know, I think you should try and do it because I think it would be a good item for you for a long, long time.
We can sell all of them that you can make.
But you also have to be able to do it without a lot of rejects or it's going to be too expensive. So it's a compromise.
The selling price has become important to units like this, as they're now free to keep much of what they earn. So when the discussions about quality are completed, Charles, Mr. Chen from the Arts and Crafts Department, and Moteheda's overseas Chinese agent get down to the bargaining.
It is somewhat in the tradition that Mrs. Moteheda was talking to you about. But again, our volume that we can take from you really depends on price. This is beautiful. We can sell it. The lower the price, the more we'll sell. And we've gone through this. It's taken us 3 years.
Price is bargain price.
All right.
Bargain, yeah.
So
That's good.
The price we offer you is what we can afford to sell it.
Well,
That's the most important.
I think we have to ask the factory, do you want a large volume of this? That's one price. If you don't want a large volume, maybe then the price should be higher. But if you want a big volume, then we have to bargain on price.
这 price 啊，这个
Okay.
原先的 price 没你让他放心好。
You don't have to worry about it. Said the prices should be right.
Okay.
We have full confidence in you. But there's always a point that whether we can afford it or not.
Very good. We'll finalize it tomorrow then.
Yeah, yes, definitely. Everything has to be finalized tomorrow.
Okay.
About price-wise. And it will be, that according to him, will be bottom price. But all depends.
Okay.
You have to remember that they're only beginning to do this kind of export. Is it 4 or 5 years? That's all. And one has to have patience. And if you don't have patience, you better not go to China for anything.
The lunch break is over at this commune just outside Canton. Most of the people who live here are the children and grandchildren of overseas Chinese who've returned and settled since the revolution. Until recently, this was just an agricultural commune. Agriculture is still important, but the commune now has its own container factory. The plant is a joint venture between a Hong Kong-based company and China. It's designed to produce 10,000 containers a year for sale largely to the US market. George Ling, the man behind the project, is taken on regular inspections of the factory by the commune leader. He was born in China, but left when he was 17 to study in the United States and Great Britain. He returned to China with his wife during the Cultural Revolution. The social experiment he longed to be part of went sour, so he moved to Hong Kong, where he set up as an architect. He was persuaded to go back to China to do business. This is his first venture.
In 1978, China began to have this open door policy. People began to approach us because we have known, so to speak, both worlds. We could provide a kind of bridge that was necessary, and doing business was a very natural thing at the time. There was opportunity, so we did. Remember, when we started this thing, China was just beginning to open up, and beginning in this new program of modernization. So a lot of things were new. Start shipping the steel frame for this building. They were much larger than the port could handle at that time. And also, like in any other industrial society, you have the infrastructure to support a plant like this. Now, if we need a screw or need a bolt, we have to go to Hong Kong, unless we have everything planned. Now, of course, gradually, they begin to build this infrastructure now.
So far, the plant has not been profitable. In fact, George Ling has been close to losing $2.5 million on it. One of his first problems was persuading the commune to cut production when the market for containers collapsed. They were actually producing more than the factory's theoretical capacity, as they were used to the government buying whatever was made.
They wanted us to buy containers continually, irrespective of the market. Then, when they began to see that company after company go bankrupt and see the figures of the shipping lines only shipping 50% capacity, they began to realize the seriousness of that. Some of the criticism that the foreign businessmen have in China is because of this lack of understanding of Chinese way of doing things, and also partly because the Chinese at that time didn't have the corporation laws, the tax laws, the whole legal infrastructure there. As a Chinese, I think, even though the situation is not that clear, there's a trust between the overseas Chinese and the Chinese government. So a lot of things are unwritten. So our contract is about that thick, you know, very thin compared to a contract signed elsewhere for the similar kind of projects.
George's company has some advantages when dealing with China. He speaks the language and knows the culture. But just like Western traders, he's had to cope with Chinese suspicions of capitalists. He feels the Chinese have been victims of their own propaganda.
When they started to open up and trying to do some of the things that the ways the West do business, they think they only have to concentrate on money and profit making, and that's very unfortunate. They tend to neglect that throughout the history of capitalism there was a lot of regulations and rules developed, what the business world called business ethics. And actually those are rules of the games that is developed, without which you can't even play the game.
George Ling is just one of the hundreds of thousands of Chinese who came to Hong Kong to create one of the most vigorous cities in the world. Ceded to the British after the Opium Wars, it has grown from a small station for refitting British ships to an ostentatious example of unfettered capitalism. Some Western commentators see Hong Kong's material prosperity as a vindication of the free enterprise system. With the economic success has come an obsession with materialism. While the Chinese authorities won't want to adopt all that Hong Kong has to offer, just across the border they're experimenting with their own version of capitalism. The tranquility and gentle pace of life in the small fishing port of Sherco was roughly broken in 1979 when the Chinese government designated it one of 4 special economic zones. The zones are designed to attract foreign capital and technology, but also to restrict the contaminating influence of foreigners to a few small areas on China's fringe. At the largest of these zones, Shenzhen, the atmosphere is like that of a gold rush town. Nothing seems complete, nothing permanent. Everywhere buildings are going up, roads are being built, sewers being laid. What attracts foreign investment is a plentiful supply of cheap labor, low-priced factory space, low taxes, and the fact that profits can be taken out. However, to prevent foreign control of these zones, the government has adopted a policy of joint ownership, sharing the management and the profits. Take this factory. The money to buy the milk packing equipment comes from Hong Kong, part of a $4.5 million joint venture. The commune that runs the associated farm used some of the money to buy over 1,000 top pedigree cows from New Zealand. It's all part of China's efforts to acquire the most up-to-date. They have new technology on the farm and in the factory, and they earn a small return on the milk they sell to Hong Kong. By 1985, they expect to supply all of Hong Kong's milk. Joint ventures like this help tie Hong Kong and China more closely together, and also ensure that China doesn't give up her sovereignty to overseas businessmen, even if they're Chinese. Even international corporations are willing to accept the idea of joint management because they view the Chinese market as a potential crock of gold. But they all face problems when starting up. The women who work here are largely unfamiliar with modern factory life. Many were often unskilled farmhands. They may be paid more in these special zones, but they have to accept far more rigid work routines than they're used to. They've had to discard the idea of the iron rice bowl, guaranteed work and meals, and idle workers can even be fired. Television training has been introduced by this company to help new employees acclimatize to factory life. By and large, Western working practices have been accepted by the authorities, though it's a slower process to get workers to adopt them. Trade brings new industries, new technology, and new working conditions. It's also begun to change social habits. Fast food has reached Shenzhen. The layout of the restaurant would be familiar in many European or American high streets. Workers with only an hour for lunch and often away from their family now eat out. They want fast service. Paper cups and plastic spoons have taken the place of china and chopsticks. There aren't many restaurants like this in the country, but its presence pinpoints the dilemma the country faces in opening its doors to the West. Its very popularity symbolizes the threat to the traditional way of doing things in China. It's not only foreigners who are experimenting with private enterprise in China. Li Xiaoyan is 22 years old. She lives with her family in a small apartment in Canton. For 3 years she was out of work and stayed home to help her mother. Today her mother helps her. A high school graduate, she failed to get into university. But with 10,000 applicants for every place, that's not surprising. Now she has a stall in the local free market. During the Cultural Revolution, markets were banned. In 1979, there was a major change in policy, and free markets, where stallholders traded on their own behalf, were again allowed.
首先方便咗群眾購買啦，因為佢國營商店，我哋而家啲個體戶可以補充咗國營商店或者國家嗰啲有啲漏缺嘅地方，我哋可以補缺咗。二來咧咁樣咧，我哋咧咁樣嘅個體戶咧就比較靈活啊嘛，就方便咗群眾。有時我哋可以，有時有啲嘢咧，我哋可以平啲買都可以嘅咁樣，即係冇話受死一個價額嗰個金額嘅限制咁樣。咁啊另一方面咧，就而家我哋待業青年比較多啊，咁樣係可以解決咗就業嘅問題，咁而且亦都減輕咗國家嘅負擔咯。
Li Xiaoyan was just one of the 25 million unemployed before the free markets were set up. It said they've absorbed several million jobless. They've also given opportunities for stall holders to make a reasonable living, and in this market for customers to buy products that are not available elsewhere. But Canton is not China. The young here are not typical of all the youth in China. They may, however, be trendsetters. Li Xiaoyan tries to satisfy the new tastes of Cantonese youth. She studies magazines, looks at what visitors from Hong Kong wear and at what her competitors are selling. But why did she choose this work?
點解要去咁樣工作？即係 覺得佢比較乾手淨腳啦，唔使話擔憂佢話縮啊臭啊咁樣，起碼我今年賣唔晒，可以明年賣就咁樣，最多係蝕本嘅啫，或者甚至講得好彩啲嚟講咧，就賺頭蝕尾啦。
During the day, Miss Li leaves her stall in the hands of a sister or cousin, while she takes material to be made up and collects completed clothes from friends and relatives who help out. Miss Li doesn't like to refer to her assistants as employees, even though it's now legal to employ up to 4 people.
搞掂啦，搞掂啦，有啲辛苦。俾翻你先，即11件啦，連埋呢件。11件。你幾時？聽日最好俾到我。聽日。好啊好啊。你有冇錢去先？聽日可能要晚上喎，因為你呢度未有得俾我嘛。你聽日俾咩？我俾翻錢。10件即係4蚊係嘛？唔該晒喎。多謝喎。多謝啊！咁我車埋呢幾件。哦，你今晚過嚟。我今晚又嚟呢度攞埋啦。好先。得閒過嚟。
By day she sells clothes, at night she makes them. It's only when demand is high that she's forced to put out work. Now she's successful, but she had difficulties at the start.
好似資金方面啦，咁樣就係一個最大嘅困難啦。咁係父母支持嘅。首先出錢買一部機俾我哋咁樣做起，買部打筆機咁樣。最初資金啊，分文都冇。
The picture is of Tsai Shen, the god of good fortune and money. Even with his presence, Miss Li does not expect to get rich quick. She makes a reasonable living, would be happy to make more, and does not want things to change.
有咁嘅感覺，即係覺得做生意咧，即係比較自由一啲，咁啊比較靈活一啲，就冇咁話上班啊落班啊咁樣冇話虧死咗。但係咧就好辛苦啊！8點鐘開始，到晚上11點鐘到啦，即係左右咧，即係8點鐘左右到11點鐘左右啦，晚上。如果按自私啲嚟講，咁樣自己散漫慣咧，就都係想做生意嘅。雖然係辛苦啫，即係自己即係覺得比較自由一啲咁樣。即係如果返單位咧，就如果散漫慣一下返去咧，就覺得好似好唔習慣啊咁樣。
It's 8:30 a.m. This department store is already packed and will stay like this till it closes at 7. Most of the retailing in China is done through department stores. And because Chinese work 6 days a week, shops open for 7. Many of the products are way beyond their pockets. There's no hire purchase here, so people have to save long and hard to be able to afford things like this. A washing machine may cost as much as a year's wages. China is not yet a consumer society, but the refrigerator, the washing machine, and especially the television are available for those who can afford them. And even the Chinese are concerned to keep up with the Joneses. Most Chinese, even if they can afford to buy, are very careful with their money. They take the same care as though they were looking for the freshest food in the market. And it's no surprise. There are no guarantees. If you get a faulty product, it's hard luck. The Chinese are faced with a dilemma. They want Western know-how, technology and investment, but they're not sure whether they want all the values that seem to go with them. In the past, the Chinese have absorbed foreign influences while preserving their essential Chineseness. Today they fear this may not be possible. At the moment, if values are under attack, it's in the towns and cities, not in the countryside. And it's here where most of China's population, over 800 million people, live and work. Is the fear of westernization unjustified then? Wherever you go in rural China, there are signs of economic change, but as yet few signs of the West. For centuries, the peasants have been isolated from outside influences. Are they now going to exchange new values for old? In the end, it is whether these people's outlook is changed and how far that'll be the real measure of the impact of Western trade on China.